Welcome back to the ASP.NET MVC 2.0 series here on TechPub. And today we wrap it all up. This is the final episode. And what I'll be doing is creating a site showing you how to put it all together in order to create a nice maintainable application for now and into the future. So let's take everything we've learned and build out an ASP.NET MVC 2.0 website. I'll be using Visual Studio 2010 today, as you can probably tell. However, everything you're about to see, you can do in Visual Studio 2008. In addition, if you want to stay with a different version of the framework, you sure can. You can just drop down this list right here and tell it which version of the framework you want to use. But I will be using 4.0 today. All right, well, to get started with MVC 2.0, you come in, pick your language, choose Web, and then choose, of course, MVC2 Web Application. I'm going to use the incredibly bland name Web, and I'll tell you why in just a second. And I'm going to be putting this into a TechPub directory. While we're getting started here, let's pay attention to the organization of our project. It's too easy to have files kind of spread everywhere, and I guess there's no other way to put it other than Visual Studio doesn't really have a very good file organization system straight out of the gates. Okay, and then I'm going to call this starter.2010. I'm also going to have a 2008 for 2008 people. And when we're done with this, we'll hit OK. And it's going to create the project. I am going to say no. I do not want it to create a unit test project. Now, the reason for this is if you create this unit test project, the project type will be of type unit test, and people that have Express installed won't be able to open it. So it's probably a better idea, since all of our unit tests are going to be in a class library anyway. Just keep it empty. We'll fix this in a second. Okay, so it's going to load up our template. All right, well, this is familiar territory. We have a brand new empty website. That's good. So one of the things I always like to do before I get rolling and doing anything is I want to make sure that nothing is broken. So in the framework, making sure the installs are all good. So what I'm going to do is just run this and make sure that it loads up properly. And it looks like it's going to. It has no reason not to, but you never know when you get a bad install or something's funky. Maybe you're on a VM and who knows what could have happened. Okay, so it's up and running. Framework's working. .NET 4 is working. That's all good. So I'm going to come back in here. And what I want to do right now is organize my project a little bit. I'm going to be adding 2 additional projects. I'm going to add a test project and a task project. It's not something we've talked about much, but it's one of the tips I'm going to give you right now. Well, the first order of business here is to organize my solution, and I very much want to have a unit testing application. So I'm going to be using a class library for that, and to do that I am simply going to come over to the File menu and add a new project, and that is going to be Windows and Class Library. And so I could call it something with a really long namespace, company name, .project name, .tests, but there's really no need to be so verbose. If your solution is named your project name, generally the team should understand. Now, I know that most companies might have naming guidelines. Of course, stick with those. But if you don't need to, well, hey, just call it something simple like tests. Well, in this case, I'm going to be doing behavior-driven development, which I'll talk about a little bit. So instead of calling them tests, I'm going to call them specs, and I'll tell you why in just a second. So this is a regular class library. I'm adding it to the solution. I hit OK. And that's great, but now what I want to do is make sure that Visual Studio put it in a place that I wanted it to, and I think it probably did. From what I understand, it's better, yes it is, at the solution organization, and there it is. Great, so I have specs and web in the same project root. I'm happy about that. Awesome. It's always exciting when I get class1.cs. In fact, through every single version of Visual Studio, back through Visual InterDev, I've always wondered why they throw that in there, because no one ever uses class1.cs. It's a very, very funny little idiom. I think it's a joke. I really do. I think the engineers that put Visual Studio together giggle about it. I honestly do. Okay, so let's do this. Let's add another project here. This is a tip that I picked up from Rails. And what I like to do is to have a console application that does a lot of things. It can go through and prune your database of bad words, bad records. You can run spikes with it to see if you can do certain things. There's all kinds of things you can do with a console app, including build in more concrete tasks that you might want to run on a timed basis, what they call cron jobs in the open source world. But you can build these things to run from the command line, and you can set up timed tasks to run on your web app, such as scraping your database for certain reports, maybe creating a CSV on the fly, sending it out via email to business person, stuff like that. So what I'm going to do is just call this tasks, and I will kind of buff that out in a little bit, make sure it goes into the right place. It is. And then we go. Great. So tasks, specs, web. I'm set. These are the only three things that I'm going to need in this solution. Now, if you have Visual Studio Express, you probably will not be able to add these additional projects. And if you can't, it's not the end of the world. You do want to make sure you're testing, but in terms of the task runner, you can probably kick up a separate C# project if you like. I got one last thing I need to do, and that is I always like to have a lib folder, which means library. You can call it dependencies if you want, call it whatever, but I put it at the solution level, and I pretty much just right-click, open window in Explorer, and then inside of here I just right-click, new, and folder, and inside of here I call it lib. Now the reason I do this is because I want all my dependencies to be at the root, and I want to make sure that whenever I add a reference to any external dependency, such as a testing framework or let's say an ORM, data access tool, whatever, that I can check that into source control, because I want the references to be local here. If I have a reference to my GAC, which is kind of the built-in assemblies that are part of the .NET installation, if I have a reference there and someone else doesn't have it installed, well, how many times have you received code from somebody, tried to run a project, and oh, bam, it crashes? It's because you don't have a particular dependency and you got to go and install it. It's kind of a pain. If you can get in the habit of dropping your DLLs into the lib folder, it's a good thing, because then everybody who takes your code can run your app from the get-go. The MVC team did a really good job putting together this project template that you get by default. However, I think there's some things that we can do to organize things a little bit more clearly and also inject a bit of opinion. So let's do that, and this comes from every single project I've ever done with MVC, which is quite a lot by now. I've always had these folders, and I've always arranged things these ways. So to get started with, the term content for a folder doesn't make much sense, because inside of here, well, what we have by default is CSS. And so what I want to do is kind of follow the Rails convention a little bit, and the reason I like this is because everything inside of this directory, and Rails does this, means that the public can consume it, such as CSS files and so on. It's sort of like the DMZ in terms of networking. And I like to organize it typically by adding in images directory and also some CSS directory. There we go. And finally, I usually like to have the scripts directory inside public, because once again, it is consumable by the public. And not only that, but I like to call it JavaScript, because I don't really have much other types of scripts. Well, there we go. And let's move this into here. That's going to break everything in the CSS, but that's okay, because I'm about to break that anyway. All right, well, another thing I know that I'm going to be doing in here, I'm going to add a directory because I like to customize the code templates every time I use them. I find that if I take about a half hour, 45 minutes to jigger around the code templates, it saves me about 6 hours in the long run. Seems completely worth it to me, especially when you're in a big fat hurry. And so one of the conventions with MVC is if you have a directory called code templates inside of your application, this isn't something we've talked about much, it will use the templates in here to generate things such as your controller or your views. It'll use these T4 templates inside here instead of the ones that are down in the bowels of Visual Studio. All right, well, we've got that. And the next thing I want to do is rename this models directory. It doesn't really make much sense to have it plural. You have a model that has classes in it, but generally don't have more than one. Anyway, so there's that. I also know I'm going to have a ton of helpers in here. I always do. And so in goes the helpers folder. And let's see, the next thing I know I'm going to have, as every project does, is the notion of core things. Let's call them horizontal tools, cross-cutting concerns, things like logging and so on. Those go into a directory called infrastructure. There we go. Okay, well, the next thing I want to do is I know I'm going to have some things for reporting in here, very specific things. It could be reports themselves. It could be stuff like CSVs I want to drop later, but actually not reports. I want to say reporting. I want to keep reporting separate from the model because, well, believe it or not, reporting is a separate concern. than the model. So I kind of like to keep that segregated. Now it's just my particular take on things. And there we are. I think it's a rule with ASP.NET MVC that if you have any kind of discussion or screencast or blog post about ASP.NET MVC, it has to include a reference to inversion of control. So if I didn't do that, then I'd probably lose my geek badge. However, I want to show, as we build out this application, why inversion of control is so groovy. In fact, this is usually one of the very first things that I plumb into any website that I build using MVC. So what I'm going to be doing is adding in Ninject today, which is my friend Nate Kohari's very groovy inversion of control container. I downloaded the installation stuff, and I extracted the two DLLs that I will be using today, ninject.dll and ninject.web.mvc DLL. You don't particularly need this one right here. However, if you use it, it kind of throws in a little bit of love to make things a bit easier for you to use it with ASP.NET MVC. Okay. Well, so what is IOC? Why are we trying to do it? I'll tell you right now that if you don't know what IOC is and you want to know more before watching what I'm about to do, head over to the free concept series we have here at TechPub, and IOC is one of the first ones I did on Ninject itself. Otherwise, hold on to your seats. Here we go. What I need to do is open up the global.asax, and I'm going to collapse this so we have more code window here. And there we go. Yes. So what I need to do is I need to tell the application here that is no longer an HTTP application. It is going to be inheriting from Ninject MVC application. And so to do that, I'm just simply going to change the inheritance scheme here, and it is a Ninject HTTP application. All right, and if you don't see the namespace pop up, you hit Control period, drops down the using statement, and there we go. Override on application started. There we go. Okay, inside of here, I'm going to do all the same things I did on app start, but this is a very special little method that we're overriding here, in that it's going to allow me to register my controllers as well, and that is the other method I'm going to be calling register all controllers in assembly.get executing assembly. Simple. You can also use magic strings and say take my web.dll and run with it, but anyway, this is the safest possible thing to do. All right, so we're registering all of the controllers, and this is handy because what it's going to do is it's telling Ninject you have control now for instantiating these controllers and also inspecting them for injectable bits, let's put it that way. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, hang tight, we'll get there. Well, the next thing I need to do is to wire up what they call the kernel or the container and tell it what things to bind. So I'll write some quick code for that here, and it's a Ninject method again called create kernel. Every time I set this stuff up, I always think of the Bauhaus song, Terror Couple Killed Colonel. Never mind. I like Bauhaus, Peter Murphy. Anyway, okay. Well, we don't really have anything set up yet. We don't have a kernel idea of what's going on here. Well, the code to do this, you just have to tell it to create a new, let's say return new standard, and this is an inject thing. And we hit Control period to make sure we have using Ninject up there. And in order to get this kernel, remember the kernel is the container that holds all the objects. We'll talk more about this later on. But you need to tell it, well, here's the modules to use. And if you're like me and the first time you use this and you were sitting here going, kernels, modules, who comes up with these crazy names? Well, Nate does. But just know, a kernel is an object container. A module is a set of rules for creating the objects that are inside of that container. So what I'm going to do right now is kind of leave this empty because what I have to do here is to create a module. And well, we don't really have anything to inject just yet, but I will soon enough. So that's what I'm going to do next is to create a method for all my rules. And so right now we are all set, and inside of the create standard kernel, we're going to say use a new site module to find all your rules. And now we are wired up. Cool beans. Okay. And once again, if I went a little quick for you right there, just know that we have all of this and more in the free concept series. Okay, well, let's run our app and make sure that we didn't break anything. And let it load up. Cool. Oh, we did break something. We moved the CSS, so we can't find it. But that's okay. I'm going to take care of that in just a second. One of the fundamental features of any application is its ability to log what's happening over time. And you want to do this in the beginning so that when you write out your functionality, you are sure to plug in the logging of that functionality so you can watch what's happening. Now, I'm not going to tell you when and how much to log. Of course, it's up to you and your application's needs. You can log too much, diluting the good information that's in there through tremendous log dumps. So it's up to you how you do this, but you should have it plugged in no matter what. So the thing I'll be using today is nlog, one of my favorites. And if you want to use something like Log4Net, or maybe you have a super Wamedian logging tool that you really like, it's up to you. I'll be implementing this behind an interface so you can plug in whatever you like. All right. I've downloaded nlog.dll, and what I'm going to do right now is to head over to my project here and then do as I've been doing, add a reference. Don't you love how fast that pops out? Okay, popping in nlog. All right, well, the neat thing about nlog is it's highly configurable, and you can configure it based on events. Now, a lot of people I know say, I got my own logging tool, I wrote it myself. That's great, but a lot of times it's one of those discovery things where you discover, oh, wouldn't it be great if... Well, the guys at nlog have thought of that about 4 or 5 years ago, so it's already in there. And when you discover the functionality in there, like emailing you on fatal errors, it's great. Okay, so what I need to do now is I'm going to add in. That's great. All right, well, inside here, I need to set up some configuration settings for nlog and tell it how to log what and when. Now, I have these saved from other applications that I've been using, so I'm just going to copy and paste them in. Okay, well, here we go. It's your very typical XML config file. You give it targets so it knows where to write the log to, and right here you can see you have a choice: console, file, and event log, which is great. Just know that I think this is a medium trust violation to write to a event log that you don't have access to, so you'll need full trust on your app if you're going to write to the event log. There's other targets as well. I'll let you read the documentation for that. And you can see down here basically are the rules. And so if it's info, it's going to write to a file. And if it's fatal, it's going to write to the event log. So now what I need to do is I need to, inside of here, just tell it the application is starting up. Well, how do I do that? Oh boy. Well, this is where it gets kind of interesting because, well, I don't have any kind of way of calling it, and I certainly do not want to load up nlog on the fly just to write to it. Instead, I'd rather have it controlled using some kind of thing that can control its lifetime as a singleton, let's just say. In other words, I need to set it up with dependency injection / inversion of control. So let's do that. And this is where our infrastructure comes in, because infrastructure, again, is kind of the horizontal or cross-cutting things that the app shares across all functionality, including the ability to log. So I'm going to say logging inside of here. And what I want to do is create an interface called iLogger. And I'll open up the code window and say I want a new interface, and I'm going to call this interface iLogger. Great. All right, well, inside here, I just need to set this interface up, make sure it's public, and I need to put in generic things like, well, log a warning and info and fatal and exceptions and so on. So let's set that up. All right, couldn't be much easier with nlog. We, of course, just have to instantiate the logger, as you can see here, and then it has pretty much corresponding methods to the ones that we wrote. In fact, most loggers do. I have a little tool in here called log utility, one that I've used before, that basically builds an exception message, as you can see, out of an exception. And we are good to go. All right, well, now that I've got logging, what I can do is I can come back over here to my global ASAX, and what I want to do now is facilitate the logging of, well, when the application starts. And I want it to be governed by Ninject. So inside of here, the first thing I need to do is I need to tell it to bind interface to a given instance. So what we can do this way, using inversion of control, is we can program against interfaces in our application and not worry about their instantiation. Ninject is going to handle it for us. All right, so to do that, we just simply say bind. As you can see here, you give it the interface, and I will say iLogger, control period, bind iLogger, and then we say to, and then we're going to tell it n. Good. Okay, well, we have an interesting choice now, because remember, the kernel or the container is going to manage the lifetime of all of our objects. And at this point, I could save a little performance and whatnot if I just manage the lifetime here, and I could set the scope. I could say manage it by request. I could say manage it by thread. I can also say by singleton. Now, there's really no reason to instantiate the logger every single time. In fact, if I just held it in memory, it would be just fine. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep it as a singleton. All right, well, let's set this up now so I can access this from inside here, the global ASX. And to do that, I need to refactor just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a property. Instead of having a method here called create kernel, I'm just going to have a iKernel property, and I'll just say get container. And then in here, I can say return container. Good news. Okay, well, that's awesome. Well, now what I can do is on application started, I can come up here and I can log it. I can say container, and then I can use the get method, get, and I just have to pass it this. It will use the rules from the site module to pull the proper logger out, and then I can just say info, and I can say application started. There we go. Okay, that feels much better. All right, well, let's see if this whole thing worked. I should have everything set up properly, and hopefully the site will load and not crash on me, and we should have, woohoo, it's exciting stuff. So now let's just go back over here to our Visual Studio action, and inside of the logs directory, let's view everything. There's our site log, and look at that, application started with a timestamp. All right, logging is set up. Well, if you recall, I was moving some directories around, and I managed to blow up the CSS here. And what I want to do now is fix that, except I'm not going to be using the default CSS that comes with the template. Instead, I'm going to be using one of my favorite libraries. And it's not to say that the CSS that comes with MVC2 is not good or anything. It's pretty good. It's very good, as a matter of fact. What I want to use instead is one of the Fluent 960 or Fluid 960, whatever you want to call it, tool sets that's out there. And my favorite, and there's a lot of them, is Blueprint. Now, I know a lot of CSS buffs out there say, stop, don't do that. That's like using stored procedures and so on for your data access or data sets and so on. But the truth of it is that a lot of CSS people really agree that there's a place for Blueprint, and you can build out good CSS on top of Blueprint, and Blueprint just simply handles where things are located on the page. I think it's insanely easy to use, and it helps you get your site off the ground, and I don't think it causes any problems. Opinions may vary, but I like it, so I'm going to drop it in. All right, well, I've downloaded this, and what you get when you download it is a whole bunch of files, including CSS goodies and so on, and examples and ways you can use things. So I'm going to drop this into my solution right now. All right, here we go. This is the Blueprint CSS stuff, and it's kind of interesting the way this is laid out. They give you the basics of what you need. It is, again, just a core framework that you build your stuff on top of. And that might sound strange when we're talking about CSS, but I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. All right, well, the first thing that you want to take a look at if you open this thing up is screen.css. Inside of here, they have a pretty good reset. They also have core typography. They default the font for you, line height. They default the sizing and everything. I'll close this window. Default the sizing of things, margins, all the things you could imagine for legibility. And then they also give you this grid system. So the Blueprint grid system works pretty much like any other CSS grid system if you've used it before. There's a bunch out there. It basically has a container that is essentially centered on the screen that is about 950 pixels wide, give or take. And inside of this container are other little divs, and you mark those with column, the class column. And then not only that, but you have to tell the grid system, well, how many cells does it span? And it uses a float system. So if you're familiar with float left and float right using CSS, you can tell it span 2 cells, 3 cells, 4 cells, 5. And you can see down here that the width it's going to set that div to. Now these are all floated to the left. So when you pop these things in there, they just basically pile onto the right, making out a nice cell-based grid. So it's very, very functional. And if you kind of keep the math in your head, you can make some pretty cool looking pages. The default HTML helpers that come with the framework are pretty functional. However, there's always room for a little bit of opinion and then some. And I think helpers are kind of one of those things that everyone's got as a bit of a tool chest in their code library that they drag into every single project, and I am no exception. I have a bunch of favorites, and if anybody downloads any open source stuff I do on MVC, they'll see these things, and so I've just added them into the project here. And a couple of things that I've added are, number one, XSS helper here. And if you're following along with the series and you watched me do the security episode, you saw that I wired up the anti-XSS library. And you can see here that it doesn't quite exist. It's because I need to add a reference to it. So I've downloaded it from the Microsoft site, and I really quickly need to add in a reference to the anti-XSS library. It's once again in the lib folder here. There we go, and it goes great. And I always use the H encoder here because I like to use the library instead of HTML.encode. Okay, well, the one that I wanted to show you in particular, and I'll talk about the rest later on, was the HTML helpers, and that I like to kind of add for my own use here. All right, so what am I doing here? Well, the core of it, I have these workhorses that I use all the time. These just output script tags, script, CSS, and image, as you can see here. And this is just simply so I can say html.image. It'll go to my images directory, and I can set those things at the top right here. I tell it where the public directory is, /public, CSS, images, JavaScript, and so on. All right, well, let's make this site master look a little bit more concise. And what I'm going to do inside here is just get rid of that CSS call. And instead, I'm going to output my little helpers here that, well, call out to the CSS files. And one little thing that I like to do, only because I like this convention with Rails, they don't make you put in the extension. And if you don't put it in, then I'll append .css on there. Anyway, so I have site, screen, and print. And one of the overloads I can put in there is the media that I want it to show for. And so that's one of the neat things about Blueprint CSS is it figures that out for you. All right, so I have that in there. The other thing that's really groovy about Blueprint is that it compensates for IE weirdness. So anything below IE8, you can also embed that. So let's do that too. And it's one of those little comment if IE8 or if less than IE8. There we go. And it's going to output. Great. Okay. And public CSS IE.css. And that just does some really quick adjustments. All right. Well, good. Well, I got the CSS in here. And I think what I'm going to do for a start, I'm not a big fan of downloading JavaScript if I don't need it, but I know I'll be using jQuery quite heavily on this site. Most people do. So I will usually just output jQuery at least minified, so it's not terribly heavy. Plus jQuery is very small. So let's add those in as well. Okay, well, there's our jQuery. Okay, well, now that I have everything plugged in here, let's run it and take a look at how it looks with the CSS styling in place. Probably not going to be too terribly different. The typography is different, which is great. And I can even do way more than what I showed you with the special typography plugin. I can also do some funky button stuff, and I'll show you that in just a bit. For right now, though, things are looking kind of the way I want. In here we have Helvetica for the headers, and for the body text, Georgia. I find serifed fonts look pretty good for readability, but of course people can change that as they need to. All right, well, this looks good to me. I'm on a roll. Now what I want to do is I'm going to come back into Visual Studio once again, and let's doctor up this homepage a little bit to use our Blueprint stuff rather than the forced layout that is on it now. I don't really like fluid pages very much, or elastic is what they call them. The centered 960 stuff is great for legibility. So let's change all that out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to blow away the default one just so you can see how this all works. There we go. And there we go. And so now there's no CSS in here from our default template. And I'm going to run this. All right, well, this is what the site looks like without any CSS. So what I'm going to do is just really quickly implement the grid system so you can see how it looks. It's pretty simple stuff to do. And so I'll pop back in here. And what I'm going to do inside the site master is to implement the grid system. So, all right, and before I do anything else, I'm going to take out the page class here. There we go. And we'll just leave this like this for now. Probably going to rip out that footer too. All right, so let's run this and see what we come up with. Okay, so to see this, I got to stretch the window a little bit. So you can see how that's starting to move. I don't have too much real estate here because the page is very small in this window, but hopefully you can see the way that's working. And it looks like I need to shrink this a little bit. There's some overlap here on this one, so I can do that. I can basically, I can just set this. It doesn't need to be 12. I can set this to, let's just set it to 10. And then we'll go back, and hopefully that'll bring that up to the side. And it did. Great. All right, well, we're going to jockey this around a little bit. Actually, I should right align that. And this is one of the fun parts about using this thing. If I just come in here and say right, that is going to align the text that's in there to the right. So hopefully it'll push that control over to the edge. And it did. Okay, well, hey, we're getting there. Well, as you can see, I've been having a little fun with the CSS, and Blueprint just makes it really easy to kind of shove things around the screen, and next thing you know, you're putting chickens on there. So one last thing I'd like to show you about the CSS is the buttons feature. It comes with some built-in really nice graphical buttons, and to show you that, what I'll do is I'll replace this text right here with the CSS that comes in the buttons. So let's take a look at that really quickly, and if I pop this thing open, you can see under or right above fancy type here we have buttons. And if you open up README, it shows you all the things you can do, and you just add these guys. So what I'll do is first I'm going to go into the site master, and I am going to copy and paste this line right here. And let's drop that down. And then I'm going to just say I don't want fancy type, I want buttons as well. Great, buttons. All right, and so now what I want to do is I'll go back into the readme.txt because it gives me the HTML here, and I'm just going to drop these buttons in, and right here on our home page, so drop those in. And so now if I refresh this, you should be able to see how the CSS can style you up a pretty groovy button, and it's coming up. There we go, and look at that, pretty neat. If you hover over it, you can see how the colors change, and this is all just really nice styling. You click it and, well, it acts like a button. So that's pretty handy. Okay, well, let's move off to other good things. Talking about CSS for too long puts people to sleep. I think the site looks pretty groovy, really digging the rooster. Now what I want to do is actually have the site become a little bit more functional, meaning that if I click on the login link here, that it actually takes me off and shows me a form where I can log in. And a lot of people have asked me about this, sent me emails and so on, saying, if you had to do authentication with MVC, I mean, how do you do it? Because with web forms, it's pretty simple just to drag a login control or register control and so on, even one of those wizards, onto a page, and it handles everything for you. Well, the good news is that if you want to use the stuff that comes straight out of the template for doing this, you can. Phil and team have included some pretty functional stuff. You have an account controller up here, and you have your account model that handles all the user registration stuff and interactions, and you have reviews. Those are all good things, and they work straight away. You can log somebody in, register them, and so on. However, what I want to do is something that's a little bit more flexible, and this goes along with a more opinionated approach. And one of the things that I very much want to do today in showing you how I would build an application with MVC is to not only show you an opinionated approach, but also a more maintainable approach. And you hear that word a lot, maintainable. And a lot of people think, well, what does that really mean? I mean, does it make sense? Maintaining code, what? Well, one of the interesting things is the development process, the initial development process when you sit down to write code, throw together an application. That is about 15 to 20% of all the code you're going to write over the lifetime of the application. So part of what I want to do today is to show you that approach. How do you build a maintainable application? And part of doing that is to not have systems built out like this that depend on another system. In this case, these things depend on the membership being in there. Now I know that Phil and team have stubbed these things out in interfaces. It's a little bit too much for what we need to do. So what I want to do is take a little bit of a different approach. And again, offer that this is opinionated. Doesn't mean that my approach is better. It's just what I like. All right, well, the first thing I'm going to do might seem a little bit drastic, but I'm going to come in here and delete all of these things out. Again, it's good code, I think. I just don't want to use it for what I need today. And so I'm starting out with the principle of YAGNI, as they say, just what you need. In this case, I need something to validate someone's credentials. Now, this is thing one. When talking about a membership system, is there is a difference between authentication and authorization. A lot of times people kind of put those two things together. Authentication is simply a system that verifies someone's identity when they come to your site, that they are the person who they say they are. Authorization is a set of rules that allow you to evaluate whether that person can do a thing. So I'm going to treat those as two separate systems. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I'm going to add this to my infrastructure because, again, authentication is one of those things that is core to all applications in just about every system there is. And so inside authentication, I'm going to have an interface, and that interface is going to be, can you guess, Authentication. So inside here, I will just type in Authentication. And this interface is simply, for right now, going to convey one method. This is all I need right now, is valid login. I think. Okay, well, at the core of it, that's all I need right now. Now, in the future, I am sure I'm going to need a registration process. I will put that in here. But only when I need it. Okay, now for right now, that's pretty much what I need. And now what I want to do is I'm going to add in a concrete class, and I'm going to call this ASP membership authentication. There we go. Okay, and this, can you guess, is going to implement authentication. And then we're going to right click here, and we're going to implement this interface. Boom. Good. Okay. Well, now in here, all I need to do is ask, is this a valid login? I'm going to ask the membership system, so I can say membership. There we go. All right. And let's go ahead and build this, make sure I didn't blow anything up. And I did not. All right. Well, good. Well, how do we know then we're going to be using this authentication system? I mean, isn't this kind of weird? Isn't this just a little bit too much abstraction? You're going to have to instantiate something. I mean, I don't understand. If you're going to do this, why don't you just use that? That's what it's for. Well, the cool thing is this is why we have dependency injection. So now what I'm going to do is come up here, set a new binding. Inside here, I am simply going to tell it to bind, and then authentication, and control period. There we go. We're going to bind authentication to, and we're going to set this to ASP membership authentication. That's it. Okay, so now if we want to use this in any one of our controllers, we just simply have to ask for the interface. DI is going to handle this for us. All right. What I want to do is to create a controller, and I want to kind of keep it RESTful. And, you know, again, people might be saying, why don't you have something for an account? Because I don't have the notion of account right now. I don't. I just want someone to be able to come and log in. Is that an account? Is that a user? Is that a person? What is that? It doesn't make much sense to have something called an account controller handle something like authentication. And reasoning it out, what we're really talking about here is a session that someone is trying to create. So in that sense, what I want to have is a session controller. The RESTful approach to which would be that if a person creates a session, that they log in. When they destroy a session or delete a session, it means they log out. Now, this might sound strange. A lot of people might be saying, wait a minute, are you actually going to handle the ASP built-in session object with a controller? No. I'm just trying to keep with a RESTful approach is all. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tooling here. I'm going to create a session controller, and I'm not going to do any of these methods here. I'm just going to leave it the way it is. I don't really have index to deal with, but what I do have is create. But first, what I want to do is take advantage of DI because I have Ninject stuff going on, and what I want to do is come in here and tell it to create a constructor for me, and what I'm going to do is ask it to inject authentication. All right, well, hey, we now have a way of asking if someone has a valid login. So now what I want to do is to create the methods that are going to be displaying the page and then also handling the postback for when someone logs in. All right, well, here's some usable code. And I just have an action result to create or return the login page, which is session create. And then another one to handle the postback. So right straight away, what I want to do is impress upon you the importance of getting into good habits. And particularly what I want to do, even though no one's really probably going to want to spoof the login form, maybe they would. I want to be able to validate the anti-forgery token. We need to do that always. It's just good to do it by default. There's nothing wrong with doing it too much. And so this is pretty much all I need. Now at this point, of course, I'd be tempted to crack open the views and say, let's test this, but I don't want to do that. Right now what I need to do is to segue a little bit off into testing land because I'm starting to write some logic here. Then I don't feel too comfortable going too far without test to back me up. Let's set up testing for our solution here. And one of the things that I really enjoy when doing testing and development is behavior-driven development. I like it particularly because you focus on the behavior of the application and not so much the individual bits of functionality. And when you do that and you write effective specs, you don't have the added weight of a bunch of tests that break when you decide to refactor. But that's not the main aspect of BDD. The main aspect is that when you write your tests, otherwise known as specifications, you keep in mind the business angle, the business value of what you're doing. So one of the tools that excels at this is Cucumber, and that is used extensively with Ruby on Rails. And there's a port for, many ports actually, for .NET, and one of the most usable and most advanced ones is SpecFlow, which is right here. I've downloaded and installed SpecFlow, and understanding the tricks with it isn't too easy, but well, let's take a look at some code and see how it works. These higher level BDD frameworks usually sit on top of established unit testing frameworks, and that same goes for any BDD framework in any language. They usually sit on top of something else. SpecFlow uses NUnit, which is great. It means I can run the specs in any test runner, and I'll show you that right now. Well, the first thing I want to do is a little bit of organization, and I really like the way Cucumber works in Rails in that you have a features directory, and inside features go, well, all your features, and I'll show you that in just a minute. And then you also have a steps directory. Great. And so basically what you do is you spec out your features, and that is the syntax I just showed you on the site here. These guys. So you spec out these guys, and your steps are the code you write, so that when these things are stepped down into, that code is called. I know it's probably sounding a little strange right now, but I'll show you that right now, as a matter of fact. So let's write our first feature, and what I'm going to do is I am going to right-click here, add new item. New item dialog is going to pop up. And the installer, as I mentioned, throws these templates in. I'm going to be using the SpecFlow feature. And the cool thing is, well, it gives you boilerplate code. So you can see how everything works before you get started. Okay, well, this is an interesting little thing that we have here. This is kind of a modified T4 file with its own generator. So with this file comes a bit of code itself generated off of the Gherkin syntax. So underneath here is a bunch of basically ignore the man behind the curtain kind of thing. But it's essentially writing these NUnit tests. It's a long explanation, but yeah, it's using the NUnit framework to support the features and scenario stuff that you're writing above it. Just know you don't have to work with this code. In fact, I'm going to close it because it hurts my eyes. But in here, you can see here is our spec. We are defining a feature, addition. We're basically saying here is the motivation for it. As a user, I expect to see this. And then we have scenarios underneath it. Like scenario number 1, adding 2 numbers. That is addition. And then you basically follow a given when then, which follows right along with arrange, act, assert. Well, I don't have any code to support these steps just yet, but I can still execute them. I can run them. And so if you're following along at home, know that if you just right-clicked on here and hit run test or tried to run it with ReSharper, you'll probably get an error. Because it's going to look for the tests inside of here and it's not going to find them. So what you want to do is just right click on your project, hit run test, and it's going to load up testdriven.net, and there we are. All right. Well, this is where SpecFlow is pretty groovy. It's saying I don't have any steps for this thing that you've mentioned. So this step right here, given that I have entered 50 into the calculator, I don't have a step for that. So why don't you go ahead and write this code right here, and it actually gives you the exact thing you need to do. So I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Well, where do I write this code to? Where do I write the code to support the steps? Right, let's put them in the steps folder, and once again, I'm going to hit add new item, and it gives us a template for this step definition, SpecFlow step definition. So I'm going to add it, and once again, it's boilerplated code. And so inside of here, we have a special class with the binding attribute on it, and it's just being called step definition 1. And it works based on finding a method with a particular attribute. So it's trying to basically do a little reflection, scanning the assembly, trying to basically match the Gherkin syntax with an attribute. And notice here it also lets you use regex, which is pretty neat. And it takes that regex and it passes it in as an argument. So if I run, there we go. Well, and we get a little bit of different report. It's saying, okay, I found everything, but we still have some problems. It's not executed because one or more steps aren't implemented yet because they say pending. Now, for a lot of people, if they read this, they're going to say, how can you tell what that thing is saying? Well, So you get used to it, I guess, is the easiest thing. So right here, the output is simply, given I've entered 50 in the calculator, pending. And then it says right here, and and blah, 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 skipped. Well, it skipped all of the rest of these because this one's pending. It's figuring, well, if this one's pending, then there's nothing else I can do. All right, well, if we don't like testdriven.net, we can certainly use a different test runner. In this case, I can use NUnit. I can use 2.4 or 2.5. There's a bit of a weirdness with them, and I don't know if I'm having version collisions, but I've never really got this to work right. But if I launch NUnit 2.4, it'll load up my assembly. It sees everything in here. I can hit run. I get red. I'm supposed to actually get yellow because it's inconclusive, but it still works. The output is just the same. It's basically saying these things have been skipped. Now, if I run this using 2.5, which I'll show you that right now, test with 2.5, and we hit run, a little bit better of a return, except it's all question marks. Unfortunately, this returns as green. Well, anyway, look over here at the question marks. Okay. Well, let's actually do something real, shall we? What I'm going to do, I'm going to ditch these things here, just delete this, and I want to write a new set of features. And let's just really quickly add a new item. I guess I could have left those old ones in there and renamed them. Spec flow feature. What I want to do right now is I want to write specs for the authentication. So I'm going to call this user authentication. Groovy. Okay, so what I can do right now is I can run this, and I'll use test driven and run my specs, and then out comes a bunch of stuff. All right. Well, it's telling me, it's complaining, I don't have a step definitions for this first thing. I need you to put that in there. Okay, so in my user auth steps, I'm going to come down here. I just copy and paste it. I'm at the point now in my spec writing here that I need to go against the authentication service so that I can prove that a user should be able to log in. And now I could just use the one that I've created over here, the ASP.NET membership one. However, for that to work, it needs to go against a database. And a user in there might exist or might not. I certainly don't want my test here to fail if there's no data in the database, which they will. So that is a very brittle test, as they say. It is depending on an external thing. I don't want that. So instead, what I'm going to do is to mock that service out. Basically say, Jedi mind trick on the code, hey, it really doesn't exist. And so to do that, I'm going to use a mocking framework, and it's called mock, M-O-Q. And I've added a reference here to my test project. So the first thing I need to do is to create a reference to the service that I created, Authentication service, because mock works with interfaces and, well, mocks them out. Okay. So for any string, I want it to return false. Now it's going to execute these in order. Might have been a more efficient way I could do this, but there it is. All right. Well, good. So now what I can do is I need to set this object up here. And this is what's awesome about a mocking container, because now what I can do is just say, hey, auth, you're going to be equal to mock.object. Done. And the object is typed, as you can see, because we declared this type up here. Done deal. All right. Well, now what I can do is down here, I need to be able to say assert and control period, because I'm using NUnit assert dot true, and then inside of here I'm going to say auth and is valid login and username and password. Great. All right, that's it. That's all there is to mocking. Okay, so now I can come back over here and I can run my test, and it loads up the DLL. Great. All right, so getting there, and you can see done. Great, done. Good news. Okay. Well, now what I need to do is I need to go back in and write some code here for this. Should not be able to log in, and that's good news. I just need to come down here and should not be able to log in using admin and bad guy. So once again, I want to pop those in here. Search dog and false. Okay. Well, now I should get all green lights on my specs. Oops, hit build. I meant to say run tests. And there we go. Passed. Awesome. Well, overall, this was easy. And what we're doing here is BDD. We mocked out our interface and we ran our stuff. That's all good. And to see what this looks like in NUnit, we can hit test with NUnit. We'll use 2.5 this time. Loading everything up, hit run. You can see our tests show up right here nicely. Green checks. It's exactly what we want to see. So let's take a look at data access, and it typically is one of the more interesting features for developers to geek out on. And what I'm going to do for this starter application is to borrow from things I've learned over the last few years, and where applications tend to be after a year. What are the things you're focusing on, trying to tweak, trying to push? I want to build those concepts in from the start. So the first thing I want to focus on here is I want to make sure I abstract away the data access, because I know data access strategies are going to change. Link to SQL, Entity Framework, and just today on Twitter, this is kind of funny, couldn't have been more timely, Miguel de Icaza announced DB-Link, which is an open source multi-DB provider. Link for Mono. I mean, that's great. Link for Mono. It goes to MySQL, Postgres, SQLite. Same that Subsonic does pretty much, but I have a feeling theirs is probably way better. Anyway, you want to be able to leave yourself light and nimble in case you need to correct course along the way. Not only that, one thing that I've really learned in terms of tweaking for performance is that these ORMs come with a lot of extra bells and whistles. Object tracking is one of them. And we don't always need object tracking, especially for the read-only pages. Like maybe your home page has, well, a lot of hits. So let's implement this right now. And I'm going to put it inside of my infrastructure directory. And I'm going to simply create another directory called storage. Here we go. And what I want to do is I want to be able to capture working with some data repository. It doesn't have to be a database, as many people know, especially those who read my blog. NoSQL is basically on the rise. And what I want to do is just kind of have an interface that has the notion of adding data to some sort of persistence, updating that object or that data, and then deleting it, and then reading it using link. So believe it or not, I have a really nice interface that I like to use for that. So let's take a look. And here it is. It uses the classic unit of work pattern. For those who are not familiar with unit of work, it basically you open a thing that you can think of as a session against a storage persistence medium. And then you work with a bunch of objects, and the unit of work keeps track of those changes. And when you're done, you say commit, and all those changes are run in transactionally. If you're familiar with Link to SQL, then you're familiar with unit of work. The data context is a unit of work. All right, so as a lot of people who read my blog know, I'm really a big fan of DB4.0. I'm also a fan of Mongo. So I have these kind of NoSQL object databases that I really like to use for the application stuff. So for fun, I'm going to include those in here as well. There you are. So I've added in my DB4.0 server, DB4.0 session, and this thing is just abstracting out an object server. So I have some references in here that I should tell you, DB4.0 and DB4.0.link. DB4.0, I should mention now, is not free. However, if you run an open source project you use a license like a new BSD and so on, you can use DB4.0 in that project. You have to provide their, I forgot what they call it. There's some license that allows you to not contaminate your project. I also have Link to SQL that I can throw in here. So let's do that. There we go. This is going to bomb because right now I don't have a data context on which to go against, so I just won't compile. But essentially, this is how you wrap Link to SQL behind the interface that I just mentioned. And if you are sure to use this instead of the Link to SQL implementation, you're going to save yourself a lot of pain. As I mentioned, one of the things you might just want to change out in the future is your data access tool. A lot of people do. They swap it out, go then Hibernate. Swap it out, go Subsonic. Whatever they want to do, they hand roll their own stuff. That's all good. Just make sure that you can unplug it using an interface and that it doesn't break the rest of your application. Okay, well, I've got this, and this is your basic session implementation. However, as I mentioned, I really want to be able to go against read-only stuff that I can optimize for reads. So for that, I want to have, well, as you can imagine, a couple more interfaces and a couple more implementations. All right, there we go. So let's take a look at the read-only session. And this doesn't really use unit of work. It doesn't need to necessarily. But what it has inside of here is, again, just pulling back iQueryable. Couldn't be easier to work with. Let's take a look at our Link to SQL read-only. You can see what I mean. So inside of here, you can see we have object tracking enabled equals false. You could also, if you wanted to, go in here and pre-compile queries that might be a little bit more intense. You could alter this as you need to. And once again, I have some errors happening because I don't really have Link to SQL set up, but I will. In fact, I'm going to set that up right now. One thing that's crucially important to get right from the get-go is reporting. You really want to make sure that you have a facility in your application that allows for the business folks to know that the application is working properly. Even if it's just you really want to be able to look back. You want to trap things like user activity, what are people doing, how long are they spending on your site, and so on. Now, there is Google Analytics, of course, but you can tweak Google Analytics to do your bidding. However, nothing replaces business-centric good old reports. So what I want to do is I want to set up reporting right now, and I'm going to treat it as if it's going to just be a completely different storage mechanism. Now, of course, you can come in here and change this as you need to. The implementation that you're about to see me do just uses the same session that I've been using here before. However, if you want to make it explicit, like an explicit old school repository pattern, feel free. Whatever is going to help you in the beginning to implement this properly. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to be able in the infrastructure to set up a brand new directory here, because reporting can happen in a lot of ways. It can either be sent out to data storage, popped into a file somewhere, XML for download, CSVs, who knows. And what I typically do is I just kind of give it its own directory in here. And I also have a special interface that I like to drop in as well. And here it is, my reporting interface. A lot of people might be looking at this going, wait, this isn't an interface. This is just kind of a different tag in here. Well, that's true. But this is wide open for me to implement custom methods as I need to, like methods like track user activity. Or I don't need to do that at all. If I have a facility like Link to SQL and I want to expose Link to SQL using iSession, I can. In fact, I'm going to. I'll show you that in just a second. But the cool thing is this lets me use IOC against iReporting here, and I can point to whatever reporting backend I like. So I'll show you that in just a second. And what I need to do now is let's just set up a database that does that. Pretty much every site has to have some type of user tracking. And so I'll set up the bare bones, and I'll drop in a database, throw up Link to SQL against it, and show you how I would put this all together. Okay, I've added in a database here called reporting.mdf, just thrown it in the app data folder for simplicity. If I head over to the Server Explorer, drop open the tables, and you can see I have one user activity. And inside of here, I just have a typical integer-based ID. It takes in a username, string for the activity so we can report off it, roll it up. There's, of course, other things that should go in here. But this is just by demonstration to show you how you can get started with this. All right, I've also added a Link to SQL class set up here, DBML. And then I have, if you come and take a look at properties, inside of here I have given it the context namespace web.reporting, and my typical convention-based thing is to just call the context itself DB. It helps for me to visualize this. All right, so I have that all set up, and people, I can see how people looking at this, and I've received so many questions. Why is this like this? Why do you have a separate session in here, a separate kind of thing for reporting, especially for Link to SQL? And the answer is because I like to keep, again, the app storage completely separate from reporting. Now, there's really no extra code in here. This is just inheriting from a regular session. However, this is going to let me keep things separate. And to kind of visualize this, let's head over to the global ASAX and wire all this stuff up using dependency injection. All right, so what I have right here is my ninject module. So what I want to do right now is I want to bind my iSession stuff. And should I choose to use DB40, I certainly can. And I would say DB40 session. Now, if I want to use Link to SQL, I can do that as well. But I don't want to. I want to use DB40 session. And there we go. I'm going to do that. And then I can do bind. And for this, I'm going to do my read-only stuff, which I talked about. This is going to be the high-intensity stuff for like the home page and things where I don't need to save any objects. I can just use the read-only session. And then I'm going to bind this to, once again, I'm going to bind it to DB40. Great. And then I'm going to bind my iReporting here. Here it is. I'm going to bind this to my Link to SQL reporting. This is why I need all the separate objects. Okay. Seems a little overly complicated, but remember, I'm looking at this a year into the future. What are some of the things that I'm really going to be grateful that I have? What are some of the things I really want to make sure that I can use? And these have always been in place for me. Okay, well, how does all this work? I don't quite understand. And the best way to see how reporting goes together, I mean, it might be easy to see how the read-only and session work, but what if I want to report on something and I want to make this simple? So let's do something with the user activity. And what I want to be able to do is to log user activity. And so I'm going to, inside of reporting here, I'm going to add a class, and I will call this user activity. There we go. And I'm going to make sure it's a partial class because it's going to be sharing responsibilities with the link to SQL class. And you might think, okay, well, then you got to spin up a data context in order to save all this stuff if you put on your link to SQL hat. Well, I don't want to do any of that. Again, I want to let Ninject inject the repository that I will be saving this against. So let's write some code. And here we go. So to reiterate, one of the problems, classic problems of maintainability, is that you end up having these dependencies kind of all over your application. And when you want to change out, for instance, if you decide my application's growing, I need to get off of link to SQL, you've got to go in and find every case where you wound up a data context, and you've got to take it out in favor of the new thing that you're using. Well, I'm trying to get around that. I'm using a link to SQL object here, but I don't want to have to use the data context. I don't even have any notion of link to SQL in this thing, yet it is a link to SQL object. I am injecting the iReporting, which is where user activity is going to go, and then iReporting is just going to add it in using my iSession interface, and it's going to commit the changes. Easy as that. Okay, well, I have a pretty loosey-goosey way of moving forward. Let's see how all of this goes together now with my application as I complete working on the session controller. Okay, we're back here in the session controller. I've just laid out a lot of infrastructure stuff, some testing and so on, and I want to complete this thing now, now that we have tested our auth service and so on. And so inside of here, as you notice, I'm not really doing much except asking if we have a valid login. I should really be tracking this and letting the activity log know that the user has just logged in. So to do this, I'm going to use dependency injection handled by an inject. And so inside of here, I simply need to say iReporting. And then what I want to do is I'm going to create a user log or user activity object, control period, and we'll call this log. Okay, and now I just need to instantiate that, and I'll do that right here in the constructor. And I'll say log equals new user activity. And then what user activity wants in order to be instantiated properly is an iReporting session. That was just handed to us by our dependency injection framework, so I can just pass it reporting. Great. I have no trace of link to SQL in here, yet I am using a link to SQL object. That is groovy. All right, so right here, after the valid login, I simply want to just say log, then where is the method? I think it's logit. There it is. And the username is going to be login. And I don't need another password, of course, and I'll just say logged in. And again, I know there's a lot more I can do for reporting, but this is, again, just by way of example. All right, feeling good about this. Let's go and construct a login page. All right, and here we go. So let's try it. Application started. Head over to our login page. Great. Well, I don't really have a login yet. Don't really have any registration, but let's just see what happens here. Login, and probably nothing. It's going to fire up that method. Hopefully it won't crash on me. And yeah, nothing happened. All right. Well, so what we need to do now is to come up with a nice way of notifying the user. We also need to be able to, well, put in a login that we can use. So let's do both right now. But what I want to do now is to add some groovy visual response, something akin to Flash in Rails. And wouldn't you know, I have a library for this that uses some jQuery grooviness. So let's plug that in. I think every site needs a good notification scheme. And one that I particularly like is Stack Overflows. So I've kind of, well, modeled what I'm about to do after that. And so let's just close up our pages here. And I'm going to use a handy dandy helper that I've had around forever. And I call it Flash. And let's drop that in. There we go. Okay, so back in one of the episodes about views, I believe it was episode 7, we talked about temp data. This is a special server-side thing. It uses the session, but it only keeps a chunk of data around for the span of 1+ request. So if there's a problem and you need to redirect or something like that, you can use temp data to do it, and then the item of data will stay in for the request +1, and then it'll go away. And it's just very efficient in terms of handling data and not polluting your session. So what I have here is just some extension methods off controllers, flash info, flash warning, flash error, and so on. And then down here, I have an output for flash. And this uses jQuery. I know a lot of people are going to look at this and say, Rob, I can't believe you're putting HTML, but just get over it. It's okay. And so I want to be able to output the flash message somewhere on a page. So the good news for me is that it's exceedingly simple to plant this helper right now into my session controller for when someone logs in and they have a failure. So what I want to do here is I want to be able to put an else. And then I want to be able to handle that by outputting a flash message. And I can say equals this. Oops. I don't need to say this. I put this .flash warning. Don't want to have an error in there. I can just say invalid login. This is important. You don't want to say couldn't find your password, don't know if you're a user, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just saying flash a warning. Boom, invalid login. Easy enough. Now, if I want to show this, I want to do the Stack Overflow thing, and I want to make it site-wide and ubiquitous so I can call it from any place. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with the site master, and I'm going to drop this down right above the header. And it's going to do some groovy jQuery, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But I need to update the CSS, and I need to update the master page, so I'll do that right now. Okay, here we go. So I'm outputting html.flash method, and this just is simply going to inject some JavaScript on the page, which is going to use jQuery document.ready function. And what it's going to do is use a little jQuery UI love, and we're going to do a slide down, slow, and we're going to toggle if they click on inside of the Flash div, and we're just going to show the message. Easy enough. And so back here on the site master page, that's where that script is going to be output right there. And then I have a div with the ID, of course, named Flash. I'm also injecting the CSS. It's invisible, of course, at first. And then finally, I've added some CSS, which you're probably going to want to change, although I don't think it's that bad. Error, warning, and info. So those are the ones that we need to concentrate on. Okay, so this should work nicely. So now if I run the site again, and we go to the login page, doodly-doo, doodly-doo, and if I hit login, now I should get a nice little warning. Boom. That's what we like to see, invalid login. There's lots of ways I can do this, of course. It's all handled by jQuery. If you want to use another system, there's one called JQ Growl, which I really like. And that outputs a growl style message, which is like a Mac kind of notification. And that would go right here. But for users of Stack Overflow and other people who use browsers, this is pretty ubiquitous, and I can just click it and it goes away. Well, that's pretty handy. All right, well, let's go and add a user in and see if we can log in and get it to log us properly. Now to do this, I'm going to use a feature that not a lot of people know about. We covered it in the last episode of the series here, but if I click on ASP.NET configuration, it'll load up config pages and I can go and add a user. Here we go. So the first thing I'm going to want to do, it's interesting, they'll never change these pages, but they work just fine. I want to enable roles, of course, and I want to create a role in here. And I'm going to call it typically administrators. Select a role, done, create. All right, cool. So now I can log into my site because now I have data in my membership database. All right, so let's close this. Now when I come back here to log in, everything should be good. I can go admin password 123, and hopefully I'll get logged in. It won't crash on me. Boom, I'm logged in. All right, well, let's see if it did our bidding for the log. And I come over here and open this up, user activity, and let's show the table data. Fingers crossed, everything should work out just fine. Woohoo! Score! All right, well, our statistics are working, our repositories are working, dependency injection is working. We're kind of on our way. So hopefully by this time you're seeing how I'm programming against interfaces, thinking in terms of interfaces moving forward as a concept that one part of the application can use versus another part, and then I'm wiring those all together using IOC. Now, right now, it might seem like a bit of a different way of thinking if you're not used to it, but I want to reiterate again, In a year from now, you're going to be extremely happy. You're going to be triple happy that you have a separate reporting system. You're going to be super happy that you have a special high-performance, scaled-out version of your repository that is read-only. And you might be kind of happy that you use DB4O, but again, that part's up to you. Let's work a little bit more with some data, and I'd like to show you how we can use DB4O, as well as some of the cool scaffolding features and templates that are built in with MVC2. So what I have here is a class called user. Let's add some properties and methods. Here we go, fairly standard stuff. I'm sure that people have been using things just like this. In here I'm tracking logins, created on, modified, so on. I'm also tracking OpenID and friendly information, friendly name, and that's great. And inside of here, I'm trying to keep as object-oriented as I can, so I'm setting defaults on instantiation, and I have a method in here called justLoggedIn that I want to stick in to the login process and the session controller. And finally, if you're using what they call POCO development, plain old CLR objects, and you aren't overriding core object implementations, you really should be, especially the equality one. Now, if you're going to be using DB4O, DB4O uses equals, so that's the way it compares one object to another to see if you've, well, inserted it or not. One of the benefits of being opinionated with what you do when you develop these things, and also having these well-defined interfaces, is that you can bend the tooling a little bit to your needs, and you can leapfrog what would normally take you, well, a long time to set up and write. And one of the neat things that you can do is you can override the code templates. And we haven't talked a lot about this, but I mentioned it at the beginning of this episode. If you have a directory in your application called code templates and you want to override the core ones, all you've got to do is just replace them right here. And one of the hardest parts about all this is just finding the templates. And the rest of it is actually really easy. So I'll save you a little bit of digging and looking around. They are deep in the guts of Visual Studio. So program files, if you're running 64-bit, then you want to make sure you're looking in x86, Visual Studio 9 or 10, depending on which one you're using, and then Common 7, IDE, item templates, C# Web, MVC2, bam. So inside of here is a directory called code templates, and inside of there are the two choices that we are going to go into, add controller and add view. So I'm just going to take these and I'm going to drop them straight in. Now this is what's going to happen. It's going to run this template, which stinks. That's okay. What we're going to do is we're just going to say don't show this message again. It's going to run the templates. You're going to get all kinds of errors because it's trying to produce C# files, because these are T4. T4 is a little bit out of the scope of what we're talking about today, but just know they're automatic code generation inside of Visual Studio. So what I want to do is I want to be able to access the properties of these things. I'm going to right-click Properties, and inside of here, Custom Tool, we're going to turn this off. There we go. And I think once you do that, then it will remove those files. It won't run that again because these aren't executables that we want to run here. We want them to be able to be consumed by the tooling and run inside of that. So we'll turn off all of this. Great. Okay, so let's see. Every time you inside of your MVC project, every single time you do something like this and then add new item, and then you can't see it, so let's pull this over. Every time you do add controller, this is going to go in here and suck in this T4 template. And the output is going to be whatever T4 runs. So you can actually tweak this as you need. So if we remember back to all of the episodes, specifically the security ones, there's a lot of patterns that are common inside these templates, including that you really should be secure by default. Make sure you challenge with anti-forgery tokens by default, so you can actually tweak these templates to do just that. Moreover, since I'm building out an opinionated site here, what I can do is take advantage of those opinions. I can set these things up to inject iSession by default, iRead-only session if I like, and so on. So let's tweak these templates, specifically the ones I want to work with today. I want to work with create, edit, and list. The rest of them I will just delete out. I also want to heavily work on controllers. So let's change this controller template first. All right, here is my new template, and well, let's just breeze through it really quickly. I'm injecting in an iSession, as you can see. And if you're unfamiliar with T4 and this looks a little strange, just hold on tight. We'll be done in just a moment. Down here, I have reworked the index to allow for paging and also by default return a list of items down to the page. And I'm going to be using paged list, which I think is great and is part of my helpers. And then down below, I am basically pulling out a single, returning it to details. And then I've also done something I think everybody should do, is you should really be safe by default. I was tempted to leave these uncommented to force you to delete them, but I thought, I don't know. That's something, as long as they're there, it's a visual cue that you really should have them protected. So I left it as unprotected. But anytime you have, of course, anything that manipulates data, you really want to do that. Next up, I'm making double darn sure you're going to use a validate anti-forgery token. And inside here is the typical model that we use for validating data. In addition, I am creating a whitelist for you. So if you run this and it doesn't work and you're wondering why, and you have weird data, it's because you're going to have to come in here and tweak this whitelist. Either that or I'm going to manually make you undo it, because that is terribly safe. It's how you're going to prevent yourself from being spoofed. And then, of course, down here, we're using our session to save and commit changes. And this pattern repeats on and on. All right, great. So this works out just swell. And to take a look at how it works, what I want to do right now is I want to create a controller for my new user class. And to do that, I'm going to come over here and hit user controller, add actions. And we're going to add that in. And boom, there we go. Now, we're going to have some errors straight away. But it's okay because it's just a little bit of maintenance and you're using an opinionated generator. But if we come on down here, there's certain things like username. So we're going to have to come in here and tweak that. But other than that, everything is pretty Jim dandy. It works out pretty well. So what I want to do now is I want to tweak the other templates in there for building out the forms. Let's do that. Okay, here we go. I've just tweaked out the list T4 template. And the major thing I did in here is I just accounted for the fact that we're using Blueprint, so it looks a little bit better. And in addition, I also accounted for that we are going to be using a paged list, and I added in this big old blob of HTML that is going to be using some images I'm about to add for a nice pretty pager. So that's cool. And then the edit and create, I did a few tweaks in here again to make them look nice. But there's one thing that I can also do, and if you remember from the view episodes when I did the editor templates, one of the things I was able to do was to override the default implementation for the way that dates are done. So I'm going to take a quick sidestep right now and add that in. One of the things that really bumps me out is when I'm using dates and I'm using these templating things, that a big fat text box comes out, and sometimes I forget to go and change and wire in jQuery. And I used to have helpers that would do this for me. But one of the neat things that you can do now is to use editor templates, as I talked about back in one of the view episodes. So I'm going to set that up right now, and I'm going to use the exact same editor template. So what you need to do here is just type in editor templates, if you recall. And inside of here, I'm going to create one for date time. There we go. And this basically doesn't do much other than output a text box, and that text box has a class of date selector. Okay, so what I need to do is to make sure that jQuery, jQuery UI, and a bunch of other things are output onto these T4 templates by default. So jQuery is already being output. I'm going to be using jQuery UI and all of its CSS for outputting dates. So I just have to make sure those are wired into the templates. And if we head back over to our T4 templates here and resume our discussion, if I scroll down here on edit.tt, inside of here I have this HTML.datePickerEnable. And what in the world is that? Well, if I go to my helpers, in my HTML helpers here, inside I have datePickerEnable. And what this does is it outputs, as you can see, collapse this, it just simply outputs the jQuery instruction to make sure you set date picker for the date selector. All right, controller. And let's create the index page, add view. Whoops, do that again, add view. Good, index. And we're going to create a strongly typed view. Unfortunately, this is going to introspect an awful lot of stuff, so I am going to just tell it to use web.model.user. All right, there's our page, and open this up. And you can see everything that was output here. So let's run this, see how this looks. And I'll type in user. And there we go. There's our page. It's, well, hideous, but you know, it's a template and it's there for us to tweak, but it's got us a long way along here. So of course I hit edit, nothing's going to happen, and same with details. I don't have any forms yet. So let's do edit and create and see what we can come up with. Okay, well there we go. Went through the tooling, added these in. Let's take a look at these pages. Here's create. Again, I want to point out that I'm by default using the anti-forgery token in here, and moreover I am taking advantage of the flash bits that I created, my little flash helper. So let's take a look at all of this in action. So what I'm going to do is I am going to crack open the users here, and I've gone into the list page and I've tweaked it a little bit. So let's do this. We'll go user, and I've tweaked it just a little bit so that we can hit edit. And if I pull up the status bar here and you look down below, you can see that it's going to take us off to the edit page, and edit should pull up. That's good. Notice now that I have my calendars being provided to us by the login stuff. Looks like I have some CSS weirdness here. So this is all good. And what if I somehow decide to convince it I can't? It looks like I was going to say, I wonder if I could convince it that I don't want any value in there. See what happens. Well, if I hit save, what I should get back is a nice little message. User saved using the flash. That's just great. I could keep going and doing this kind of thing forever, but I think I've covered most of the bases and hopefully helped out where most people have a bit of a problem. Kind of covering services like authentication. How do you set that up? What would you do about data access? Well, I've put that in there. Logging and testing. I've hooked up all of those things. And so what I'm going to do with this is stop right here. I'm going to go in and fine tune it and make sure that it's all in good order. And then I'm going to put it up on either CodePlex or GitHub, I haven't decided yet, for you to use in your own projects. And the idea is that this is just to get you started. There's things in here that I've intentionally sort of left a bit vague so that you can go ahead and finish them, but they at least push you in the right direction. So this brings to a close the ASP.NET MVC2 series here at TechPub. And speaking for Stephen and myself, we thank you very much for watching and hope you have enjoyed it and learned a whole bunch. And on a personal note, I want to thank Steve Sanderson for his involvement. He gives me a lot to live up to. And that guy is amazing, and I can only hope someday to be a shadow of what he presents. And I am going to keep striving to do just that. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to doing more episodes on more exciting things here at TechPub. And as always, please leave your feedback. If you want to leave some feedback on the starter site, it will be open sourced under some type of license, so your contributions are welcome. Thank you very much for watching.